أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of Allah, most merciful, ever merciful, and may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So as agreed upon for this session, we're supposed to do a review of all previous lessons until now and open it up for some Q&A. So we were supposed to get some questions online. I did not receive any, so hopefully you guys have some as we go over the subject matter of the last few weeks. So what I'm hoping to do is not to talk a lot, and I'm using the questions that are provided in the lessons in the book. So as we said, this is all based on Sheikh Misbah al-Yazdi's Theological instructions. The book is divided into lessons, and every lesson ends with 4, 5, 6 questions. So I'm using the same questions. I copy-pasted them here on the slides. The author has already identified the main subject matter of every lesson. So we'll go through these. We clarify, repeat, make sure that all the important points are well understood. I also mentioned a few of the verses that we mentioned throughout the lessons that we didn't really comment on, so I thought at least that we can quickly make sure that we understand the link between these verses and what we've been saying, and then we open it up for any general Q&A regarding these lessons. So as you remember, for lesson 1, it was the introduction to the notion of religion, and so I'll go through the questions without giving any more context to see how much of it was understood and how much needs a little bit more explanation. So first question is, explain the concept of religion from a lexical and from a terminological point of view. So lexical basically means, what does the word say? So of course the word in Arabic, deen, what did we say that it means? And then terminology is always within an area of specialization. So in this case, in aqa'id, which has now become the normal way of understanding religion, is not the lexical meaning, it's not the linguistic meaning, it's the terminological meaning. So when we say religion, what do we actually mean? So anyone wants to take a stab at the first question?
Our religion system of belief that is drawn from a particular idea of how the world is, or where we came from, where we're going, and why we're here, what we do here. That's what I understand.
Okay, so
a system of belief.
A system of belief, you have to add something to it. So this is, let's say, half of the answer. That results in what?
To a practical system.
Exactly. So it's a system of belief from which there's also a system of action that comes out. So this is the lexical or the terminological? This is the terminological. So this is in aqa'id, in theology, we say this is how we understand religion or deen. So then we go to lexical. In Arabic, when we say the word deen, what does it mean? So the notion in ilm al-kalam is the same. Of course, it means the same. But the word itself, before all of this, what does it mean? And I think we gave 2 or 3 meanings generally. Yeah.
Maybe I thought it would be like faith, like no.
No. Faith is not one of them. It's close, but it's not one of them. So we said there's 2 big meanings to the word deen in Arabic. One of them is reward or outcome, and the other one is obedience. So, and the word is used as a noun, as a verb in Arabic. For instance, when you say yadeen, so that's someone who, the morphology of Arabic doesn't work in English, so I'm not going to try to translate it in the same way. The 2 big meanings for the word in Arabic are reward or outcome and obedience. But the terminological sense and the discipline in ilm al-kalam and aqa'id, it is the system of belief that also from which stems a system of action. So both of them are our rational systems, our intellectual systems. Worldview and ideology, and what's the difference between them? So I think we spend a lot of time on this. It should be easy. So what's a worldview? So you kind of answered that.
How about you ask about this one?
Yeah.
So worldview, I know that the difference between the worldview and ideology is sorry, worldview is more for a system of a belief that and the concept, like the conceptual and the conceptual sense that represent what you believe and where you're going and where we come from. What we do here, and ideology is a system of practice, system of action. So now my question is, I'm going to ask you about this one. At one point, I think you said, I got the idea that they're supposed to be similar as well, and that ideology can also mean worldview. So I'm going to ask why, and I'm going to try to answer that question.
Yeah.
Is it because ideology is something that you practice based on what you think is the right way to do it, is that right considered as a worldview?
Okay, so first we'll answer it, and then I'll come back to your question. So yes, worldview is a system of beliefs. That's generally. But we said it's not just a system of beliefs. The most important thing that we want from a worldview is that it answers the existential questions of a human being, the ones you mentioned. Where do we come from? Where are we going? What's the meaning of life? What are we doing here? These are the big questions. The answers to these questions, and they can be different from one human being to another, the answers to these, they represent your worldview. From that, you're going to have a system of actions. Every human being, when they perform any action, that action comes from a belief. So depending on what you said was your worldview, your actions are going to be different. Depending on what you believe, you're going to decide to smoke or not to smoke, to kill or not to kill. You can take it to the small things or the big things. Depending on the system of belief to your existential questions, your actions are going to be different. Now, is there overlap between these? The reason I had talked about the overlap is that I had some concerns with the author's choice of worldview and ideology. So he made it a very clear cut that there is, in deen, to use the Arabic terminology, in deen there are usul al-deen and furu' al-deen, which he equated. He said, therefore, usul al-deen are therefore aqa'id, worldview, furu' al-deen, actions, ideology. The first part we can't disagree with. Everybody agrees that religion is made up of these two big aspects, but is the best terminology to use to translate them worldview and ideology. So the issue is more, in English, the words do not mean the same thing. So it's an imposition on these words to try to make them fit the notion of usul al-din and the notion and ideology of furu' al-din. So in English, there's an overlap and lack of clarity on where each one of these starts and stops. So there's definitely overlap. If, let's say you take a word like, I don't know, Marxism. Is Marxism a worldview or an ideology? So depending on how you define the words in English, most people would say it's an ideology. And we talked a little bit about that. We said that there's still a belief element in the ideology, but then they add to it notions like propaganda, dogmatism, and some sort of activism. It's a belief that tells you to do something. So this is what the author wanted to take from it and make it into furu' al-din. But the reality is that it has a lot of connotation, and often a negative connotation. So when we say Marxism, for instance, it's not necessarily something very desirable. And all the isms, and we've talked a little bit about that, these become dogmatic, and they have a dimension of propaganda. There is an action that comes out of it, but usually in English they limit it to political action, economic action, things of that nature. So the reason why we said there's overlap in the English language of these two terms. That's one. And then putting that as, and that's why we said what I'm proposing is to use a different terminology, but I'm not going to do it throughout the lessons because I want to stick with the terminology of the book. But we said properly the proper translation of what the author is trying to say would probably be metaphysical positioning for worldview and praxis for ideology. We would use praxis, which is your system of action, instead of ideology. Praxis is neutral, it comes from philosophy, there's no negative connotation to it. And for the first one, it's what are your answers to the big metaphysical questions, which are the ones we mentioned. So, and again, you don't fall into the ambiguity that we have with the worldview notion. There is the second item, it's not that there is overlap, but there's something common to both. And we didn't emphasize on it in the first lesson, but we mentioned it later, which is, and I just said it a few minutes ago, worldview and ideology are both rational systems. But one of them has to do with big metaphysical existential questions, and one has to do with action. So they're looking at something different, but they're in the same sphere, which is in your mind. So ideology is not, I perform the action. Now I'm in another world. I'm outside of the mind world when I'm performing the action. But the reason that tells me you should or you shouldn't, that part is the ideology part. So the overlap is that both are rational systems, but they're looking at different things. One of them is metaphysical, existential, the big questions, which are aqa'id. And the other one is, it's a rational system that looks at what should you do and what shouldn't you do. And it stems from the worldview. Is that clear? Okay. So there is overlap. But when I said overlap, it could mean one of two things. One is there's ambiguity in the English language about these two terms. And if you look them up, you'll see that there is no big agreement on where a worldview stops and where ideology starts. And the second reason is they are both intellectual systems. So that's the overlap. Otherwise, they're looking at two completely different things. One of them is your system of belief, the other one is your system of actions.
So I'm just confused about why, how can our practice be considered a rational or intellectual system? Because sometimes in practice we do think, even though we don't understand why, we could probably try to rationalize some of the action. For example, praying cannot the Kaaba easier because we have the unity of all the Muslims in one place and that's the holy place. That's how we can rationalize it. But there are certain practices we haven't rationalized it yet. So is it really an intellectual, based on intellect?
So can you give me an example? Something that you do but you haven't rationalized yet. Okay. But it stems from a system of belief, and you have a system of action. You haven't analyzed why you do rak'atayn, fine. But the I should pray. The I should pray is ideology. It's an action. There is a God, there is a religion, that's a belief. I should pray, now there's a practical element to it that comes from, because there's a God, because there's a religion, because I should try to go nearer to that God and to do what He wants me to do. I don't know why I'm doing exactly this way or not doing this, but I know that the should or shouldn't, so the practical element is still here. The should or shouldn't is in my mind before so the rationalization is not that I understand 100% what I'm doing. It's why you're doing it. There's a motivation. There's something that makes a human being do something. It starts here. Makes sense? Okay. Next question. So in the first lesson, two worldviews were mentioned. Do you remember them?
I think I remember one, and that's the empirical, dialectical materialism.
No, that's lesson 4. Yeah.
So is it materialism and, I guess, metaphysical?
Yes. Well, yeah, and the way that it was defined in the book, it was divine or theistic or religious, and materialistic. So those were the two. Those were the two that were presented in lesson 1. So we'll stick to those for now.
But there's more.
Of course there is more. So it depends how you want to split the world. So depending on what you consider to be, we talked a little bit at the end of that lesson about the spheres of inclusion and exclusion. So in that lesson, the point of the lesson is to say what is a correct worldview and what is not. So the split is there. There's this, if it meets criteria 1, 2, 3, then it's a correct worldview, everything else is not. So he equated that with, this is a theistic worldview, correct worldview, divine worldview, religious worldview, and there's everything else, which is materialistic. I think today we may have some that are a mix.
When was this book written?
Initially in the 1970s. Yeah. The author mentioned that the most popular of the materialistic worldviews, do you remember? We didn't talk about it. We said it's going to come in later lessons.
Scientific
No.
materialism worldview.
Yeah. And the material, we said there's a religious worldview and a materialistic worldview. Which one? So within each, of course, there are many, many worldviews or sub-worldviews. So in the materialistic aspect, he said there is one worldview today, at the time of writing the book, that is the most popular, the most influential. Do you remember?
Communism.
Yeah, but he doesn't refer to it as communism.
Marxist.
Dialectical materialism. So the reason why we say that we use those words, is because it's a philosophical system. And the worldview is at the philosophical level. When you go into the action, it becomes the ideology, so it becomes Marxism or communism or socialism. Okay, that's what do you do with your system of belief. So we kind of disagreed with him today. So at the time he was writing it, it was the most influential. Today, it's lost most of its power, and there's another materialistic worldview that has replaced it, which is science. So we said, and this word I think is important to keep in mind, we'll talk about it in lesson 4, the questions of lesson 4. When science does science, when it limits itself to science, we say that it's science. But then when science goes outside of science and talks about metaphysical questions, what is it called? Scientism. So keep that in mind.
Can it even do that?
It does?
But it can't, by definition, because it's material.
Well, it shouldn't, but it does.
It tries to. It doesn't.
So when science writes a book called The God Delusion, that's scientism.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we agree, but the rest of the world doesn't. So you have people who will defend and say, well, this is science stepping outside of its boundaries of science. This is stuff that it shouldn't be talking about. But then the reality is, in society, it's very influential. People think that because science has facts, it's allowed to go beyond the description of these facts into where do we come from, where are we going, how should we live, what are we doing here. Science doesn't have any answers to these. The moment it does, it's stepping outside of science and going into scientism. Explain the general and the restrictive meaning of belief. So, I mean, here it's just, I won't say more. Let's see if anyone has anything to say here, and then I'll comment on it. So do you remember what this refers to in general?
Believing and taking action, or when you,
if
you believe something, automatically.
So here we're saying there's a beliefs or usul al-din can mean something very restricted, or can mean something a lot larger, a lot more encompassing.
Inclusive and exclusive, maybe?
Yes.
No.
So maybe if we ask question 5 before, it becomes easier to answer this one. So question 5. What principles are common or shared between the divine religions?
God.
Yes.
Afterlife.
Yes.
Prophet.
And prophethood. So prophethood, God, afterlife. These are the shared, common to all divine religions. So this is where the author draws the line between correct, incorrect, divine and religious worldview, and the rest. Those 3. Now, why are they important?
Is it God or oneness of God?
It's just God.
Oh, it's
So
not.
yeah, and we'll talk more about that. Let me answer this, and I'll come back to this point of oneness versus just God. Why are those 3 principles important?
Because they answer the metaphysical
Exactly.
questions themselves.
These are the most fundamental questions that are answered by these. Okay. Before I go to 4, let me say a word about that. So is it God or the oneness of God? A lot of the traditional works on kalam and aqa'id and all of that, they jump right into the oneness of God. Because it wasn't even imagined that someone would doubt the existence of God. So as more and more works started being written and they become more sophisticated and you're trying to argue with people of different backgrounds and some of them are non-Muslims or non-religious and atheists, you have to add these other proofs. So initially Tawheed is supposed to mean what? It's supposed to mean only the oneness of God. But we know that there's a premise that we need, which is we have to prove his existence first, and then we have to say, is he one and in what sense is he one, basically. So this is where, on the one side, when you read in the Holy Quran, there are verses that clearly establish the existence of God. But then there are others that almost consider that a moot point. There's a verse in the Quran that says, أَفِي اللَّهِ شَكٌّ. Is there any doubt in God? Like, is there really a need for an argument for God? So the starting point of the Quran is oneness. It's not existence. But the reality of the world is that I have to prove the existence of God to a lot of people before I can say what kind of God we're talking about. And when we say he's one, in what sense do we mean he's one? Is he one like I am one? Or is it different oneness? Yeah.
That's okay.
It's okay. Okay. So and now if we go to question 4. So keeping in mind question 5. So now we know what the big 3 beliefs are. Question 4. We said there are beliefs. In one way, we understand usul al-din as more restrictive, and another way more general. So does anyone remember or know what we're talking about?
This is the one where we say this is what defines a person to be a believer, or to be outside of the circle, being one of the believers or not.
Yes.
Something like that.
Yes, but believer in what? So now the first line we drew is correct worldview or incorrect worldview, right? So that's one. And then now we're only talking about the correct worldview. So the correct worldview, this is the general worldview, the one that everybody agrees upon. But there are more restrictive ones. For instance, if we want to add imamah, if we want to add divine justice, we want to talk about the belief system of a Christian versus a Jewish person versus a Muslim person. This is restrictive. I have to add something to the 3 big questions, my answers, and I make it a little bit more restrictive, and then I land in another worldview that is under it, subsumed under it. So now, instead of saying it's a theistic or religious worldview, I'm going to say it's an Islamic worldview, or it's a Shi'i worldview. I'm adding conditions. For instance, yes, the 3, but I'm going to add imamah under nubuwwah. I'm going to add adl ilahi under tawheed. And now I'm an imami or I'm adli, right? Okay. So that's it for the first lesson. Lesson 2. What drives human beings to want to know? Yes?
It's 5 points, right?
There's one for this one.
Okay, well...
The first point, exactly. So curiosity is a driver in human beings. The 5 is the bigger question, which is, why do we study religion? So the first reason is the first question. Why don't human beings investigate all truths? So if we're curious, we're not really driven to go find out everything about everything. Why?
Easy.
Yeah?
I think we prioritize what's more important, and then we go after those.
Yes. And usually it has some sort of impact that we can directly feel in our lives. So the importance of something becomes higher or lower depending on how it's going to change my life. Or, if you believe in it, my afterlife. Okay, good. What is the religious sense and why? And what is the evidence of its existence?
Is that fitra?
It's
I've never been here.
Yeah, I know.
it's
Well, I've been here. So like,
Yeah.
is, for the religious sense, there's 4 points that you mentioned.
Yeah.
I'm gonna mention those like knowledge, good, beauty, and religion. That's a religious sense. And for
So what are knowledge, beauty? What are those?
Education.
The fourth one that you just mentioned is
religion,
religion. So what are these 4 things?
something that you appeal to, I guess.
Yes. So this is in every human being. So psychologists, based on what's being said here, according to this theory, because he's relying on what some psychologists say. So those psychologists say that there are 4 big drivers in human beings, 4 things that motivate everything, 4 things that are found in universally across the board in all human beings. And this is their leaning towards beauty, knowledge,
religion.
yes, what's good, what's beautiful, knowledge, and religion. These are 4 drivers in human beings. So the 4th one is religion. By making religion into one of the 4 big ones, it means it's its own need.
But do atheists, like atheists or atheists,
Mhm.
do they have a drive for religion? If they think
Yes. Yeah. So according to this way of understanding the world, yes. Regardless of whether you say I believe or I don't believe, the reality is you believe. You may not believe that, the God that I believe in, but you believe in something that gives sense to your world, that allows you to perform actions, and if that crumbles, you're going to have very deep psychological issues. Yeah.
Is this why they felt the need to create scientism as one of these?
Yes, that's one way to understand it, yeah. But scientism, so from a psychological point of view, yes, but you have to look at scientism more as a kind of a historical evolution of society. So there are things that were eliminated in society, and the need for those answers is still very present, so something else has to step up. So science is now performing that role in a lot of ways, but not science only, a lot of other things too. So you have pop culture, you have myth, you have all sorts of things that are feeding that need in human beings. So what's the evidence of its existence? The existence of the religious sense. Yeah?
That it exists in everyone, like you're saying.
Exactly. So it's universal. Same thing that was mentioned for the fitra argument, that religion is fitri. The argument is, if you look at any human being, you look at humanity 10,000 years ago or today, you look at someone living anywhere in the world, there is this. Yeah.
Can we really make that statement? Because we haven't. When we make that statement, we make it a lot. We open up to the rebuttal that there's this one people in this one place that don't
Yeah.
believe God.
So we talked at length about that,
Sorry, okay.
and we said that this stems from innocent mistakes, distortions, and non-innocent mistakes. So
corruption.
yeah, corruption basically, and we'll talk a lot more about that in the but we talked a little bit about that to say, is it true that religion has always been here or not? Our claim is that it is, but we're not going to rely on that to say that's our belief, but we don't need that. Today, the psychological, that's what the answer I'm looking for. So that's one half of the answer, is that if we look at humanity in time and space, we see that religion has always been present, which is religion as in worldview from which an ideology comes out. That's in that sense. That's one. 2, if we go to psychologists today, so was a claim of the author, they tell us there's a religious sense. So when we talked about this, I said, yes, but some of them consider that a bad thing and some of them consider that a good thing. If you go to Sigmund Freud, he says this is a bad thing that we have to, as we mature as people, we have to get rid of it. And as society matures, it has to get rid of it and rely on science. Whereas his student, Carl Jung, says God and what we consider the sacred or religious is that which we find at the depths, in the depths of the soul of the human being. So if you're able to go and remove everything else, what you'll find is God. So basically you cannot interpret the world except through God. So now the job of the psychologist or the psychoanalyst is to show you how to get there. to show you that it's underlying everything that you're going through. Anyways. Explain why looking into religion is necessary, so we can give a lot of answers here. So why is it necessary to study, to investigate, to research religion?
Because it gives you an answer to the metaphysical question you have. Religion is known to have answers to the metaphysics, but the physical world does not have answers to. No, I think that's why it's necessary.
Yes, but we broke it down more than that. That's yes, but yeah, we went deeper than that. Yes.
There's the point of benefit and harm.
Okay, so what's the point?
So basically, it's you're not losing anything by looking to religion.
Okay.
You're actually gaining more knowledge. So,
Okay.
And then you more know harm. Like, I don't know how to explain it. You understand the harms that could be possible by understanding religion.
Yes.
I don't know if I explained that well.
Yes, but you have to go just a little bit further. So that's absolutely right. But then that could be said about, eating healthy or sleeping enough hours or drinking enough water. So what's one more thing that needs to be added? It's the importance of those things. So yes, there's a benefit and there's harm, but what kind of benefit and harm? So when you add that, it actually changes your whole life and could possibly determine infinity, your entire afterlife. Then this is where the curiosity has to kick in, and you say, okay, given curiosity, given the human being's desire to protect themselves against harm and go get anything that's beneficial to them, then it becomes logically necessary to. Okay, what else did we say then? Yeah.
And towards perfection.
Yes, so perfection was the next lesson. After that, this is still lesson 2. Perfection was lesson 3, and we had a full lesson only for the perfection. But yes, so we're gonna have a few. I'm gonna come back since you're gonna have to answer the questions about perfection. So we said curiosity, benefit, harm, the religious sense, and the last one.
Thanking the sustainer.
Pardon me?
Thanking the
Yes, thanking the sustainer. Those are not mentioned in the book. So those were 2 reasons for studying religion that we said are not in the book. So there are 2 of them. Which ones are they?
Thanking the sustainer.
Yeah.
And religious sense.
Oh. No, it wasn't the religious. The religious sense was mentioned in the book.
So is benefit and harm mentioned in the book?
Benefit and harm was the second one.
Is it the one you put 2 points that you added to the book, right?
I have 4 written down in my notes.
It's okay. It's okay. The last point that is Pascal's wager.
Oh yeah.
I want someone to tell me link it to why is looking into religion necessary.
Because if there is a God and you study and your belief system changes, you have infinite gain compared to small losses or small gains or infinite losses in other cases.
Exactly. So it's a wager. So even if we are not 100% sure, the risk, the gain and loss, what I lose, what I risk losing and what I risk gaining is infinity. And the loss doesn't compare to that because it's finite, because it's limited. Okay. There's a claim that we cannot reach certainty, we cannot reach 100% truths about religion. So what's the answer to that? Yes.
Direct religious experiences.
Okay, but that's not what we said. And someone could use that as an argument, but we actually dismissed it. And we'll say why we dismissed it. Yeah.
Like I said, I wasn't here, but like just thinking about it, you don't need to be certain. If the probability is high enough, you would still do it. Like if someone told you, if you don't lock your door tonight, there's a 50% chance someone's going to kill you. You'd lock your door,
Mm-hmm.
But if they said like there's a 0.000 whatever, you may not. So
Absolutely. So that's one very good reason. So that was the Pascal wager,
Right.
probability, risk, all of that. That's one. More than that, 2, we said that religion is no different as a field of study than any other field. And this is the point about laziness. So why can we spend millions and billions and trillions of dollars doing research, let's say, to go into outer space, and work on it in gigantic teams of researchers for 25 years before we reach a conclusion, but I can't read 2 hours about something and think about it because it may or may not lead. Okay, going into outer space may or may not lead. That's as one example, and we have many others. So as a field of investigation, we cannot just jump into a conclusion and say, we don't know what we're going to find out, so therefore it's not even worth investing in. That's one. 2, it has its own tools. I can't go take tools from another field and try to apply them and say I'm not reaching a conclusion. So once you get into that field, and that's the second lesson after this one, you use the proper tools to investigate, you reach the same level of certainty. It's just another field of knowledge, another type of knowledge. Good? Okay. Lesson 3. What are the premises of the second argument for the necessity of looking into religion? So what was the second argument? So here, the whole argument was perfection. That was the second argument. So he used benefit and harm as one argument, and he dismissed all the others. He said all of them are good, but the one that I'm going to concentrate on is benefit and harm. The next lesson he said, same argument, we're going to look at it from another point of view, perfection. Human beings want perfection. And so the premises were every human being leans towards, wants, desires perfection. We have free will. All of our actions have to come from beliefs. So the next lesson becomes the question to this, so which beliefs? How do we get to those beliefs, right? That's the structure of lesson 3 and lesson 4. I'm just going to jump over the human desire for perfection. We all agree that all human beings desire perfection, but they disagree on what perfection is. And we talked a lot about that. I know you're going to have a lot of questions here, but I have to go back to the lesson.
Actually, don't. Sorry.
Okay, good. What are the distinctions of a human being? So what makes a human being different from other species? A few things that
Their ability to think.
Pardon me?
Their ability to think.
Their ability to think, okay.
What do we do? And like animal instinct.
So we have a lot more freedom.
And we have everything that everything else has.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So animals have what plants have and more. Humans have what animals have and more. So what's the more? What we're interested in is their
Right from wrong.
free will and their ability to distinguish right from wrong. And we mentioned a lot of points, but what we're looking for is their ability to act freely based on reason. So my reason can trump all my instincts as a human being. The animal will act based on instincts. It's instincts that are fighting with each other. Do I flee or do I fight? Both of them are instincts. The human being has one more, if he chooses to use it, which is reason. I may trump all of my instincts and go with reason, which is what we're going to say in lesson 4 we have to do. What's the relationship between these distinctions and the true perfection of a human being? So we said if a human being does not act, their free actions do not stem from the system of reason, then they're not a human being. They're acting like an animal. They're feeding their animal faculties and they're reacting through their animal faculties to everything going on in the world, so long as they're not exercising their reason. How does ideology depend on worldview? So this one should be clear enough by now.
Because you actually are based on what you believe. But when we go, we believe things is perfect, actually perfect, in order to lead to the better world in the afterlife, for example, and we actually not have, you never stay in the same state, you all either digress or
Improve.
improve, yeah.
Yes, exactly. So it brings us back to lesson 1. We said your system, your coherent set of your system, rational system of action comes from your system of beliefs. And here we added the notions of humanity, perfection, and acting based on reason. That's it. Yeah, number 6 we don't need. That's what I just said at the beginning. Lesson 4. List the types of human knowledge and their field. So there were 4.
Empirical.
Empirical. So what is empirical? What does it mean?
It relies on your 5 senses, so what you know, like physically, directly, basically.
Yeah.
So if you're
Okay, that's one.
Religious,
Religious. Yeah.
philosophical.
Yes, philosophical. Religious was the third, and philosophical was the second. Yes. And the last one?
Rational.
Yeah, so philosophical, rational is the same. That was the second type of knowledge.
Intuitive.
Close, but no
Direct
more.
religious experience.
Which is what? The direct religious experience.
Like visions.
Exactly. You have it's a visionary thing. It's arfan, mysticism,
But it only
gnosis.
happens to you.
Pardon me?
But it only happens to
Of
you.
course, yes. Okay, so those are the four types of knowledge, and each one of them generates what?
Experience or personal.
Generates a worldview. So you can have a empirical, sensory, scientific worldview, and there's nothing else that exists. You can have a religious worldview, and we'll say a word about that. You can have a philosophical, rational worldview, and you can have a mystic worldview.
Does the mystic worldview not have a religious aspect?
It can, but it shouldn't, because the point of the religious, that's like, so we went through the tools for each. So the religious, what we should have called it is devotional. So the devotional takes out the entire aspects, which is basically I follow blindly something called religion. The authority of what I'm saying comes from this person, the message comes from them, and it stops there. The mystical, Sufi, all of that is more about there is nothing except what I directly experience with my heart and soul. You remember all of that, right?
That's why you consider it's secondary, because anything you experience has to, you interpret it as a way to explain your original beliefs or your core beliefs that you already have.
So which one is secondary? The mystical, direct religious experience, or what we call the religious?
Oh,
Which one is the secondary?
The mystical.
no, the religious.
I wouldn't call it.
The religious. Because I cannot reach that level of having a religious or devotional worldview except by having had a worldview before that from which this one stemmed. Okay. As the other one, yeah, you can jump right into it. And there are people who are not religious in our religious sense, but they still believe in the theosophy, or they're yogis, or they have visions, or God talks to them, or they are at one with the universe, right? That's the direct experience. That's the direct religious experience. A lot of quotes, yes. Okay, so what's your assessment? So what is our assessment of the scientific worldview?
It's limited.
Pardon me?
It's limited.
It's limited. Why is it limited?
Because it already depends on the five senses: feel, taste, see,
Yeah. Touch and hear. Yes, so those are the five senses. The scientific worldview is limited to those five, and the connections you can make between them and generalizations and abstractions you can take out of them, and it stops there. Anything beyond that is not the scientific worldview. This is where science steps outside of science.
That's what they claim it is.
Of course they do, and this is where we have to come in and say this is not science. And this is where you have to deconstruct the argument and show where the science stopped and they leaped outside of science. Yeah. So how can devotional information be used in providing matters of belief? So devotional is religious. So we said at the conclusion of this lesson that the proper way of approaching the worldview questions is through the philosophical rational system. We said even the religious one, we have to put it aside, because religion needs to be proven first. I can't rely on religion to prove religion. So it becomes circular logic. So put it aside, put the mystical worldview aside, put the scientific worldview aside, we're left with reason. Okay, but we said the devotional information that comes from a prophet, information that comes from the Quran, from your religion, can be used to build that worldview. In what way?
Only after we rationalized it, right?
That's one answer, yes. So once you've established, then it comes and gives you details. So the main principles have to come from reason, from your philosophical system. And then the details are from religion. That's one. Is there more? Sometimes the devotional information, while the source of it, let's say, is an imam or a prophet or the Quran, the content, the type of information it is still logical. And we mentioned verses of the Quran, and I told you guys, go read them and tell me what do you see in those verses. And we have them, and we'll finish with those today. So those verses, while the Quran says it, when you read it, it's a philosophical argument. So what I'm relying on when I mention the verse is not that because the Quran says it, it's true. The Quran is making a philosophical argument. It's not saying believe in me just because of the Quran. Sometimes it does, but some verses, no, it's establishing a logical argument. So I can still use that as a logical argument. So what is the agnostic worldview? We said that's where you experience things directly, without reason, you don't need a philosophical system. It doesn't need to make sense. It's whatever you directly experience. One. Can it solve the main worldview issues? So we, I think, gave 4, 5, 6, maybe even answers why it can't. So why can't it?
Have been tricked.
We'll go through all of them. I know there's a hand there. Yes? Who had one here? You had one? Yeah.
Well, first of all, if it only happens to you, how do other people believe?
Excellent.
You can't really explain it to others. You experience it, but you can't really make others feel it or understand it. That's what.
So these are two, you're mixing the two now. So he said one, that's true. So it's stuck to you. Now you're talking about how do you express it. That's a second. It's impossible to express a direct experience. You can't put it into words unless the other has experienced it, but they haven't. You had one?
I think it can be interpreted in the wrong way.
It could be interpreted the wrong way. Yes? They said all of yours?
I think kind of like what else said, that they could be mistaken. Is that what you meant?
Yes,
Like the person experiencing it interprets it the wrong way.
exactly. And we talked a lot about that one, the distinction between the experience and the interpretation of the experience. More than that, do you guys remember? There was one more that was big. What is a worldview?
Unrational.
It's a rational system. Is this a rational system? No. They're direct experiences of something, and they don't mean anything on their own. There's nothing coherent about them. It's just something you experience. Okay. So I'm not going to spend more time on that, but we did talk about that. That was a question I left with in the first lesson, and we didn't really discuss it. But we said if there are different spheres of inclusion in religion, then you're going to decide how much detail you add to your system of belief, and where do you draw the line that this is Islam and this is not. This is Shi'i and this is not. So then it means you have to decide where to draw that line, which begs the question, is the spirit of Islam inclusive? So are you supposed to be more inclusive when you can? Or is it supposed to be exclusive and elitist? So you want to keep it as restrained as possible, so that you only have the best quality and you push everybody else out. You say, when you get to that level. So we didn't really discuss that, and we don't have time to go through that. But this was one of the questions we asked, and we said anyone who studies long enough religion knows that it's a lot more inclusive than exclusive. One of the verses that we had mentioned, so we didn't talk about this verse, we said read it and see what the link is with the lesson. So I'll just read it very quickly. Say, do you await anything to befall us except one of the two excellences? So basically, we kill you, or we die and we go to heaven. Those are the two excellences, because we're believers. While we await that Allah will afflict you a punishment from Him or by our hands. What's the link between this and the lesson?
And the lesson.
And one of the lessons, when we mentioned this. I don't want to say which one because it gives the answer.
Related to the particular region.
Yes.
Because
It's related to the probability, right? So is that clear? So basically, depending on your system of belief, the system of belief of the non-believers is that there is nothing else. those were polytheists who believe that everything ends when they die. So the Quran is teaching the faithful, the believers, to, and of course this gives you so much energy and positivity when you get this revelation while you're in the battle. What are the outcomes for me? Either I'm victorious, so it's one of the two excellences, I'm victorious, or I get killed and I go to heaven. Again, another excellent outcome. So no matter how you spin it, because of my system of belief, there's only excellences awaiting for me. As for you, what are the outcomes? Either you beat me, which you think is good, but then you have an eternal punishment from God, or you die at my hands. So I win and you lose and you die. So this is I'm not saying, the reason this was mentioned is there's a lot of insistence in Western philosophy that Pascal was the first to have introduced the logic of probability and philosophical arguments and all of that. So I said, if you read this verse just like that, and this was just a verse that popped into my head when I was preparing the lesson. I haven't done any research and taking out, I'm sure there's a whole lot of other verses we can take out. This is one verse. So was Pascal really the first? So this was one, and the other one was a narration from Imam al-Sadiq. I said that there are two that I'm aware of, and both of them are similar. It's an argument between the Imam and this Indian physician who comes, and the Imam basically tells him, if you are right, then I've lost nothing, and if you are wrong, then God will destroy you. And I win. I've gained everything, and you've lost everything, and God will, destroy you because you say He doesn't exist. So it's the same argument, right? Anyways, that was the reason why we mentioned it. Another verse is that mentioned, it was the second one only, I think, that I gave, which was 20:50. This is where Fir'aun was telling Musa, who then, O Moses, is your Lord? And the answer from Musa alayhi salam, our Lord is He who gave everything its creation, then He guided it. So it was about the notion of guidance. What does it mean here when we say that God guided it? He's distinguishing between God creates and then He guides. What kind of guidance? Is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sending messengers and prophets to woodpeckers and ants? Or is there some other type of guidance? And does it include us or not?
I think it includes everything. At least would be because towards perfection, because the Prophet had this perfection after the spectrum and not black and white, right? Then the Prophet can't perfect themselves to a certain level, right?
Here it was more, there's two types of guidance. So there's an external guidance that I can go get from a prophet by doing what he says to do and not doing what he says not to do. But then there's also another guidance, which is the existential guidance. So if I look at my own body, my heart does what it's supposed to do. My stomach does what it's supposed to do. My hair grows and my bones grow and everything is... This is a guidance. Why do things do the stuff that they're supposed to do? Why does fire burn? Why do planets... why does gravity work in a certain way? When you look at the properties of the actions of everything, why does an animal behave the way it does? Everything is ordered. This is a type of guidance. So basically, the guidance is everything does what it's supposed to do, which is what God told it to do. Except the human being, because he has free will. This is where the guidance for the human being is. So God gave him a nature, gave him his fitrah, but because of the free will, he gets to do whatever he wants. There's distortion, distraction, mistakes, so on and so forth, but there's an external guidance. So you have an internal guidance, you have an external guidance, but you have free will. So the only thing that can step outside of the he guided it, which is the human being. So this guidance for the human being is of two types, whereas for everything else is of one type. For everything else, it's existential. It doesn't have a choice. The sun does what it's supposed to do. It's guided to do what it does. The human being, your will makes you free to be guided or not be guided. Pray, I don't feel like praying. Okay, well, the guidance has come to you, but you're not taking it. Gravity, no. Assuming that gravity is, we have an accurate understanding of gravity. Does it change? No. There's a planet cannot decide today I don't feel like, having gravity. Right? That's the difference. So I think these were the two verses. Yes. So the first one, had there been gods in them, in the heavens and the earth, had there been gods in them other than Allah, they would surely have fallen apart. So glory be to Allah, the Lord of the throne. What's the point of this verse? We had mentioned it, we said, just look into it. Yes?
Is it referring to conflict if there's more than one?
Yes. So here, what's the link between this and what we were saying? This is about the devotional versus philosophical type of knowledge. So which one is this? Do I accept this verse and use it in my worldview only because it comes from the Quran, or is there something more in it?
The fact that it mentioned God versus one Allah. Sorry, I might not be understanding you correctly, but you can actually ask a question about God versus one God. That can be rationalized. You can use the argument of one God versus many God. So you can rationalize it. So that really, I think a devotional like something that you should listen and believe. I'm not question that. Sorry, I don't understand. Listen.
Before I comment, let's see if anyone else has more to say. Yes?
Well, I guess I wasn't covered yet, but it's talking about Tawheed and the idea that God has, I guess, the attribute that He is infinite, and then there can't exist two different infinities.
Okay. So, yes.
The idea is that it's using rational arguments from religious sources. So we can actually...
That's the point. So if I'm debating with someone and this verse comes up, do I reject it, or can the person reject it because, but the Quran says, I don't believe in the Quran? Regardless of who says, there's an argument here. Do you agree? Do you understand the argument? Or do you have anything against the argument that you cannot have two infinite absolute beings in the universe? There's a philosophical argument. So if we accept the argument, we accept it because of its philosophical, rational logic. Not because it's a devotional thing where we say the Quran says I follow blindly. There are things we're supposed to do that in religion. But that's where when we go through, not all the verses are the same. Some verses say you have to believe in ghaib. You have to believe in the unseen without knowing more about it. Your duty is to believe in it. And other verses here, this is pure logic. Quran says you cannot have two absolute entities and they will destroy each other and destroy everything else. Okay, 1. 2. We did not create the heaven and the earth and Allah and all that is between them in vain. That is the conjecture of the faithless, so woe to the faithless from the fire. Or shall we treat those who have faith and do righteous deeds like those who do mischief on earth? Or shall we treat the pious the same as the vicious?
I'm not sure that after you can rationalize. You already kind of talk about something that I know that we can prove mad, like the afterlife and the course, but something called heaven or hell, or if we go to the specifics, you have to assume there's this kind of heaven and that's what I'm going to get. I don't know.
Okay, I'm gonna say something about that. Yes.
I think maybe the rational argument in the first part is that a creator would never create something without purpose.
Exactly. And then there's more, right? The verse continues, the second verse. Would it be fair?
Also the purpose is...
Would we create a system for no reason, and then when you see that there's so much discrepancy, so much variance between people who choose to be good and people who choose, can they all be at the same level? Can we treat them all the same? Would a creator create a system and let people loose and do nothing about it? So it's not that it's loose. There is something that's going to be done about it, but not in this world. So it looks like it's a free-for-all here. Anyways, so is there a philosophical argument or not? Regardless of its validity, this is not the time to go through the entire argument. But is there a philosophical argument or not? There is.
Yeah.
And there's probably a lot more than one in here. These are two verses, and that I intentionally put the two verses together. You see it's dense. It's one argument back to back with another. Right? There's one argument in the second verse, or maybe two, and one in the first. Anyways, again, same logic as what we said before. If we want to rely on these verses, and we will in the coming lessons, so obviously this has to do with the lessons of Ma'ad and the afterlife, we have an argument here. Why do we believe that there's an afterlife? Well, this is an argument. So sometimes we rely on the Quran. The Quran is basically teaching us, but not teaching us in the devotional sense. It's not saying just believe, just trust me, I'm the Quran, I come from Allah, believe in what I say and you're good. No, it's actually teaching us the argument, the proper way to build the argument. And other times it's devotional. So here we have a rational system. And I think that's all we had.
Is there time for confession?
There is. I don't know. It's very dark. I'm trying to see the time. I have no watch. It is 28, huh?
Yeah. Okay, that's it.
Is it quick?
In front of me.
Okay, ask because I have to leave to another markaz right now. So, no? Okay. We're good?
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Thank you.